Okay, everybody, welcome back. I'm really excited for this class and this discussion because this is something that has been a long time coming. We're going to spend today talking about Disney musicals. And I brought two people that are very well versed in this area, and a third person may be joining us later. And if she's able to join, she'll just jump right into the conversation wherever we are at that point. But with us, I have Greg Hellman, who is co-host of Hellman and Haver. And some of you may remember he's been on the show twice, talking about his experience working with the Walt Disney Company. And then also, Greg and I had the first conversation on Disney musicals, I think maybe December 2021 or somewhere around there. And then next I have Brett Nachman, from Notably Disney, who, for people who have seen the list, Notably Disney actually made the list of top 100 Disney podcasts. He came in at number 78. So I want to congratulate him for that. And so we're going to spend a lot of time talking about Disney musicals. But first, what I want to do is welcome both of you. And let's go give those brief introductions about yourself, your fandom, what your podcast is, and we'll start from my right to left. So Greg, you go ahead first.
Well, thanks, Cody, for having me back. Always a pleasure to talk about Disney, and especially Disney musicals. So, from a professional perspective, I work for Disney. I've been with Disney for about actually be 7 years in March. I work in global information security, so we help protect the magic, personal data, that sort of thing. The fun part of my the stuff that I do is the podcast that you mentioned, Hellman and Haver. We're a stage and screening podcast based here in the Seattle area, which is around where I live. We deal with all things film and filmmaking, classic and modern, and all things related to the local stage as well. I do theater reviews. We focus on local and regional theaters and try to get the word out locally and a bit nationally too, about the arts in the Seattle area.
Okay. All right, thank you and welcome. All right, go ahead, Brett.
Yeah, nice to be with both of you today. Brett Nachman. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Arkansas, but what makes me legitimate for this space is that I'm a big Disney fan and the host of the Notably Disney podcast, where we focus on Disney music and books, including interviews and discussions with composers, songwriters, authors, fellow Disney podcasters, and so much more.
All right, well, welcome both of you. I think the probably the best way to do this is, I guess unless I say otherwise, Greg, let's just start with you so we can kind of keep it, whenever we ask questions and talk about things, we'll just kind of keep it from left to right, unless we're changing stuff up later. The first, what I want to know from each of you is, how did you get into musicals, following musicals, and in particular Disney musicals? So go ahead, Greg.
Sure. So my history with Disney musicals goes back to when I was a kid, growing up in the 70s and seeing re-releases of Disney classics, Snow White, Cinderella, all of the classics back into movie theaters. And then, of course, you get into the 80s when they're re-released on videotape. So it's always been a part of my life, Disney musicals, and theme park visits, starting, in the mid 70s. I think the first time I was at Walt Disney World was 76. And they're always been tied together, in kind of this bigger ecosystem. So more intimately, though, over the last 8 years since I've been here in the Seattle area and getting involved in local theater, is when I've kind of gotten really into musicals and looking into them. I was fortunate enough to act in Mary Poppins a few years back as well. So it's kind of been that, always been a part of my life, and then just more recently getting really into musicals. I think the first Disney musical I saw in person was Beauty and the Beast on Broadway.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about the live, the actual musicals outside of film, which was a wonderful experience as well. So it's just always kind of been there as part of part of my life.
All right. All right. Brett?
Yeah, I can relate to a lot of what you said, Greg, in terms of your connection to an interest in Disney musicals. For me, it was in the age of the Disney Renaissance, with taking in those classics via VHS and in the theaters. The if you remember cassette tapes, I definitely wore those out as well, in addition to the VHS tapes. Just Disney was always just very much a part of my DNA, it seemed, in terms of just how I lived and breathed, and how I spent my days, in terms of thinking about the parks and the movies, and creating birthday parties around some of those properties as well. Seeing Beauty and the Beast on Broadway was certainly a novel experience, one that I don't remember as well because I was relatively young, but certainly that set a foundation for really wanting to be able to experience further productions from Disney theatrical in the years to follow. And I've seen a bunch of them on Broadway and in other iterations as well. So I think Disney music just very much consumes my soul. Whenever I'm working or studying or working out, I find myself always listening to Disney music in the background, often instrumental, but musicals definitely factor into the mix as well.
Okay, awesome.
And then I have a podcast now, so now it's very much entrenched in many domains.
And a follow-up question and Brett, you can start, but this is for both of you also. Brett, you mentioned that a lot of times you will just have it on in the background, maybe when you're working out or something. I found that I do that as well. What is it about, I think a lot of people maybe don't understand, like, just the kind of the power of instrumental music, things that don't have words in them and everything, like. And what is it about instrumental music that kind of correlates for you with doing something active or something physical, like working out, walking, running, things like that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think so many of us can agree that music is perhaps the most universal language. It's a form of storytelling, and it's also a mechanism to transport you to a different space. And when you can align it with the activity at hand, I think that's when real magic happens. So when I'm in my professor role studying, I often listen to instrumental music that's not terribly distracting, but ultimately captures the mood. So a go-to is an hour-and-a-half loop of the barn music from Living with the Land at Epcot. It is peaceful guitar at its best. It's repetitive, so I don't get easily distracted by it, but it still helps me get into the mood of being focused. Whereas if I'm going to maybe work out, I would try to channel something that's more energetic, that is helping me in that space. So that's where I'm going to go for instrumentals for a score like Atlantis: The Lost Empire, for instance, by James Newton Howard, which is very bombastic and exciting and exhilarating. So I think that's the power of music in terms of being able to further engage with whatever is right in front of you, but also have you get a glimpse into another space. So I think it can be really generative in that way.
Okay. All right. Greg, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, sure. So I think a couple of things. First of all, my favorite thing to listen to, and what I always go back to, is the soundtrack to The Rocketeer. And I think what that does when I listen to that, it provide, and any soundtrack to any Disney movie, the way they're written, the keys that they use, the way they design the music, paints a picture. I mean, when I listen to The Rocketeer music, I get images in my head that make me feel lighter, happier, things like that. You listen to the way Alan Menken describes the beginning of the music in Little Mermaid, and it sounds like an ocean. I mean, they're literally painting a picture. So when you listen to this instrumental music, you definitely get this picture in your head. So you can listen to certain things that make you relax, certain things that make you feel energized or hopeful. Or, I listen to Disney music to escape some of what's going on, in the world out there, because there's so much stress out there. It's an easy way to escape from that. And that's just those pictures that Brett was referring to, that they paint, that language that they speak.
Mm-hmm. And so one reason, the original reason to talk about Disney musicals, you can see in my background, Hamilton was such a influential musical for the Walt Disney Company more recently, especially for Disney Plus, and we'll get into that a little bit. But then in class, the students, and actually while we're recording this week is when the students are watching Hamilton on Disney Plus. But through those conversations in class, I've come across a lot of students who their connection to Disney is through the musicals. It's not necessarily through the parks. A lot of times it's through the animated, maybe animated classics, or the ones in the Renaissance, which I guess now are animated classics, the more recent ones. And most of them, the ones that kind of catch on most are either musicals or ones that just have great scores that people kind of can identify with. So I do want to talk about, and Greg and I talked about this a little bit the first time we spoke, but what makes a musical? There kind of is that technical definition of what makes a musical. It's something that, like when somebody is singing, it actually moves the story forward. So it's part of the story. So the example I give a lot of times is when Luke and Obi-Wan walk into the cantina and they hear the music playing in the cantina, and even the extended version where you see a performer singing. Well, that doesn't make Star Wars A New Hope a musical. Whereas, other projects like Moana and things like in Frozen, where they are singing and it's moving the story along, and it's the people in the story actually doing the singing and the voices. That's what is a musical from the technical definition. But beyond that, I guess, what do you have anything, either one of you, anything beyond that needs to happen for you to consider it a musical? And we could kind of group this with the next question also, about what makes a good musical to you, what makes one that's enjoyable or you're able to kind of latch onto. So Greg, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that I tend to lean on that technical definition to differentiate a musical from a movie with songs or a movie with music. I think it definitely uh, moves the story along, and it definitely provides songs provide context to the characters. And also the idea that the characters themselves are singing doesn't hurt either. I think when you move into that next question, you're talking about what makes a good musical. I think when music is a part of the story, that it's this umbrella that brings everything together. We look at things like The Music Man, right? The music is interwoven in every aspect of that story, and a lot of the good Disney musicals as well. When you talk about Moana, it's the music is woven into the story, not just sung. So I think so. To answer your question, I think that's what I tend to lead on, that technical definition. But then I think there's those other aspects that make them really, ones that stand out from others.
Okay. All right, Brett, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd be inclined to agree. I feel like I would be redundant at this point in terms of the notion of it being threaded. But I would also say there are great examples of musicals that have songs that do not propel the story. And I think there's a worthy debate over that. So like Moana, for instance, I always think of the Shiny song. I don't feel like that's necessarily as effective in moving along the story, but it still is an extravaganza of sorts, a feast for the eyes. I think what makes really good musicals are those that have catchy tunes and ones that actually can stand on their own outside of the context of the film. And I think that, that's what I think Disney has been so effective with over the years through merchandising and other avenues of having the product extend beyond the film, where you want to consume it in other spaces, not just in its original incarnation. You know, we
Yeah.
talk about how often musicals are those where the characters themselves are engaging in the singing, but then there are some variations of that, right? So Tarzan, for instance, none of the characters are singing. It's with the exception of the Trash and the Cam song with the Turk and some of the others, but ultimately it still holds that same formula. It's more of just a different way of relaying that idea. And then ultimately in the stage version, the characters actually do engage in the singing. It's not like you just hear Phil Collins in the background. But I think the notion of driving the storyline is key, because otherwise you just have a hodgepodge of sequences that ultimately may not feel cohesive.
Yeah.
Tonal consistency too, I think, is really important. That the mood has to match the character and the vibe of the time, because otherwise you can lose viewers that way as well.
Brett, do
So
you feel that I'm sorry to interrupt. I just had a follow-on question for that. Do you feel that when we talk about interweaving the music, that the idea of having reprises scattered throughout that kind of loop back to songs that maybe we've heard earlier, and kind of, you know, connect those dots, does that help at all in your mind?
That's a good question. I'm not sure if I thought about that. I'd be interested in your thoughts too. I think we see a lot of really effective use of that in Beauty and the Beast, with the Belle and Gaston, but also Hercules with Go the Distance. It's a way of seeing the character's growth, or at least them in a new situation. So I think when done effectively, and of course the common link there musically is Alan Menken, it allows for that sense of cohesiveness. But yeah, what are all of your thoughts? That's a really unique question.
I've never thought of that, and it actually, it makes me think about when I talk to my boys. I'll explain what a montage is. And so, when we're watching something, then my boys will ask, like, was that a montage? Is that a montage? And, like it's usually for every 5 times they ask, like 3 times it is, 2 times probably not. But it also, you bringing that up, Greg, makes me think it's not the traditional montage, but it does help to show growth. And if a montage is used to kind of show from beginning to the end of some process, that's where my mind goes, is that it's almost, and I don't want to like create something um, but it's almost like this extended version of that concept. I don't want to call it a montage, because there are technical people who will tell me that is absolutely incorrect, and they would be right. But that's what it makes me think of, is that yes, it comes back, and you, especially if you would watch those 2 or 3 scenes where the original song is, and then the reprise, and there's a few times where there's a second one, you do see growth from those characters. That's where my mind goes with it. Did you have any thoughts on that yourself, Greg?
Well, that's what I was thinking. I was thinking that when we talk about what makes a good musical, I think the a proper use and placement of those definitely, I think, steps up a musical and differentiates it. Because because of that growth, it's that incremental growth, like, calling back to something that we saw earlier, or a theme that we saw earlier.
And one question I had coming from what you were talking about, Brett, and especially when you brought up Tarzan. Do you consider, do both of you, or either of you, consider Tarzan to be a musical? Because no one, the characters, except I know there is one scene, but most of the characters are not singing. And excuse me, because it's kind of similar with Lion King, where a lot of there are characters singing, but then there's also music in the background that's more part of the score. So I think it's an interesting possible distinction. Is is a feature like Tarzan a musical in the same way that like a feature like The Lion King is? What are your thoughts on that? Brett, you go first, since Greg's gone first, and since you brought it up originally.
Very equitable. I don't care really about order, but and again, I think all of my perspectives are from a connoisseur standpoint. My partner's a scholar of musical theater, so much more adept in discussing stuff like this. But uh, in terms of viewing Tarzan as a musical, one could extend that same argument to how Toy Story, as the first Pixar film, was a radical change in terms of the formula, and ultimately set Pixar on that trajectory until Coco came along, where you would have at times songs sung by just this ethereal voice in the background, but helping drive what's happening. So whether it's learning about Jessie's story and how she was abandoned by Sarah McLachlan, or Woody making sense of no longer being the favorite toy by Randy Newman. There's this notion of having, and that's a perfect montage, by the way, Strange Things. That's, I think, brilliant. But I think it's this notion of re-envisioning what constitutes a musical. And I think we saw that shift when there was a greater sense of inventiveness in the formula. And that came from, not wanting to be so prescriptive. So I think we saw that more and more later in the 90s with Disney, at least, and certainly other studios and organizations have channeled their own versions. But I would consider Tarzan a musical in the same way that I would Toy Story 2, even though there's only a few instances, but it has those elements. It's just, I would say it's much more mild, and it's not going to consequently draw as many people from the standpoint of like, oh, that's the soundtrack I want to listen to. Now, if it were me, and I know how popular the Tarzan soundtrack was, but not from the standpoint of following that notion of a traditional musical with, often 7-8 songs.
Okay.
Yeah, I hadn't considered Tarzan a musical, nor would I have considered any of the Toy Story movies a musical. And in fact, the original Lion King, the character saying, I think that to me is a big part of it. In the lens that I look at, it's one of those things. It's like, what is it's the debate about what is a Christmas movie, right? How is Christmas used, and in the themes of the film, and it's one of those. I think there's an element to the musical that maybe you can't define, but you just feel whether it is or not. And in my case, I never felt that Tarzan was a musical. And yes, there's that one number where they're kind of beating up everything in the camp. But no, I wouldn't. I might think about that now, but at I don't know. I would not consider Tarzan a musical, because I think in my gut instinct about a musical, it's the characters singing. It's more aligned with what you would see on a Broadway stage, but on film.
Yeah. And that's what I've always considered, is that the characters themselves need to be the ones doing the I guess the heavy lifting of the singing. But that's a really interesting observation. And it does like open up this like maybe new area for people to consider. And because I know, like, with, you also mentioned Toy Story and Pixar. Like, I know I know Pixar early on was adamant about, like, Disney wanted them to have music. They wanted their characters to sing, and Pixar didn't want that to happen. But then, since the first Toy Story, some of my favorite, I don't know, soundtracks have been Pixar movies. The Cars, especially Cars 1 and Cars 2, those soundtracks are two of my favorite soundtracks that we listen to a lot. And they're none of the characters are singing in there. I think there's one scene where like Mater sings something that's like for 10 seconds or something like that. But yeah, that's a really interesting observation, Brett. I'm glad you brought that up, because now it's like, I don't know, I feel like there's like this whole other area, and maybe it's a future conversation about like best soundtracks as well, soundtracks and scores and things like that.
And I just want to harken back to something you said, which is a really interesting observation with Lion King. So there's basically 5 songs in that movie. 2 of them, as I think you were harkening back to, do not have the characters actively singing. So Circle of Life and then Can You Feel Love Tonight? It's Simba's voice, but he's not, you don't see his lips moving during that scene. And same with Nala. It's just a little bit of Timon and Pumbaa. So I think that's a really interesting spin on the notion of Lion King as a musical in that context, because from a pure quantity point, it's lacking in terms of songs.
Yeah.
And then from the traditional standpoint. So I just want to emphasize that was a really unique view of that.
Thank you. And
that's a good point. Yeah, because and then when they take it to Broadway, then they kind of turn it on its head and make it an actual musical. So
well, and you think about like Snow White and some of the earlier features, I don't know if that was more, I don't know if that had to do with cost, if that had to do with the talent that, and the cost of the talent that they were working with, things like that. But yeah, I think a lot of the earlier features don't really have a lot of character singing in them, I believe. And so it is this kind of grayish area of, I think with Disney, we see the movies that, and Greg, you made a good point that like you see something, you're like, that's a musical. Like that feels like a musical. But then there are some of those other movies that are features that maybe is open to interpretation by different people, which also makes, I think, the next things that we will talk about more fun and interesting. And the next question I had was, how has Disney been so successful with musicals? And that's at many different levels. I mean, people have the animation or the animated features from the classics up to today. I mean, one of my favorite musicals, I think, of all time is Encanto. I mean, every time you listen to that music, it just tells more of a story, and absolutely love that feature. But they've also obviously had live action. They've had Disney Channel, and the model that they use with Disney Channel to promote other things that those stars are doing. The cruise ships, the parks on Broadway. It seems as though music and musical entertainment has so intertwined with the Walt Disney Company. What do you think makes the Walt Disney Company so successful in working in this musical space?
boy, that's a good question, because everybody's done it at some point, seems like. And I think a lot of it is choice of composers, to a certain extent. So going back to the Sherman Brothers, then moving on to Menken and Ashman, and then Menken and the other lyricists that he's worked with, then moving up to Lin-Manuel Miranda. So you're tapping into a certain and they've gotten lucky in a lot of ways, because you're taking, when they brought in Menken and Ashman to do Little Mermaid, and those, they came at it from a Broadway angle, from the actual musical, and you didn't necessarily know how that was going to play, but it was something that was important to Michael Eisner to do. And then bring in Lin-Manuel Miranda, who's got kind of that popular, again, a theatrical background, but a different angle to it, and something that's popular. But aside from that, then there's the just general themes of the music. These are folks that can write catchy, earwormish songs that you're going to sing beyond the movies. And I think that's, when it comes to melodies and things like that, that's super important. So I think it's the Sherman Brothers, we sing Sherman Brothers songs all the time. We sing the Menken songs all the time. So I think it's the kind of earwormish melodies that they've been able to create, but there's also substance to it too. So I think that's what it's really been. And of course the stories. I think
Mhm.
I look at Frozen, and I think in particular, when you look at, I mean, the Lopez's are there too, right? And you know, Robert Lopez is a double EGOT, so obviously he's got experience doing a bunch of stuff. But you look at that scene in Let It Go, and I don't necessarily believe that Let It Go, while it's a good song, would be as um popular as it is had it not been for that animation
Yeah.
sequence. So it's a combination of that, the what's going on the screen associated with these catchy, earwormish type songs. So
Mhm.
I think that's what it's like, a formula they've been able to perfect and just keep deploying time after time.
That's a really good point because that's, and I think it seems to me that's a big reason why people originally started making music videos, like, and MTV and VH1 came into existence, is because you do when you hear something, and there's something to be said about it's left to your imagination, so different people can read different things into it. I think American Pie is like probably the most well-known song for people reading whatever they want into it. But it is, once you see something visually put to it, then it creates this whole other experience. And yeah, I think it's a very important point in all of this. Brett, what do you have to add to that? Why do you think Disney has been so successful in this space?
Yeah, I totally agree as far as the point about enlisting top talent. And I think that really surfaced when, when Disney movies started launching in the late 30s with Snow White, and thereafter you'd have folks with like Lee Harleen and Paul Smith, later George Bruns, and many others who were just very prolific, but also had that classical sensibility. And I think later, once the Renaissance came about, bringing in people who were emergent on Broadway, like Menken and Ashman, as you mentioned, Greg, and certainly more recently with the Lopez's, in addition to other composers, I think it creates that sense of that these are folks who are at the top of their game in their respective industries, often associated with Broadway, but sometimes other avenues as well, sometimes classical music in its own space. And I think those folks have been able to elevate projects that ultimately perhaps wouldn't be as strong without their influence, right? Howard Ashman is really known as much for his lyrics as he was a storyteller, and really bringing Little Mermaid and Aladdin, Beauty and the Beast to be, three of the most beloved movies of the generation. So I'm just reinforcing everything that you said, Greg, and also say that notion of what has made them successful with musicals. It's that they don't always stick to a formula, right? I think we've seen that during different periods. Like if certainly going back to the Renaissance, Little Mermaid through, I'd say Hercules have a common vibe, and then there's some variation once Mulan and Hercules came around, or once Mulan came around, and Tarzan thereafter. But what I was going to say was that there's this notion of reinventing stories across different media. So I think you were saying that earlier, Greg, with Lion King, how certainly it became much more expanded once on stage in terms of the songs and the storytelling, and really bringing in even more of an authentic African element, but also this notion of, well, so many of these stories are told for different lengths of time and in different spaces. So Aladdin, I think, is a perfect example where you only have the 92 animated film, but then you have the opportunity to bring it to the parks. So the California Adventure Show was about 45, 50 minutes long. So how do you condense, roughly 90 minutes into that space? And then they incorporated the To Be Free song with Jasmine. And then they later reinvented that a little bit for the cruise line, and also the stage show on Broadway. So you're expanding it a whole lot, and you have new lyrics in the mix. But then, okay, well, 2019, you have the live action version. So let's bring in Pasek and Paul to the mix. And, they were really hot after La La Land. And well, that has a very different flavor, but also complemented by all the visuals, right?
That's
So
a
I think you're
Hollywood element, right? Yeah.
yeah, and I think the choreography, the dancing. I mean, it's look at Prince Ali across its many different iterations, it's not consistent because of what needs to be done to drive that version of the story and the format and the structures and confines.
Um, you brought up Mulan, and Mulan's really interesting to me, and the Jungle Book is along the same lines. When we talk about live action and we talk about live action adaptations, um, you know, the when the Jungle Book came out, and they had in the preview Baloo floating down the river, whistling or kind of humming, um, instead of singing. That caught my ear, and I thought that was kind of a neat little like nod to it. The Lion King, Aladdin, they featured the music from those movies. And it seems by all means that, especially, I mean, with the preview and the talent, it seems like The Little Mermaid's doing the same thing. Mulan didn't. And do you think, how important do you think the incorporating the music from the animated features is into the live action adaptation of that? And Mulan's a little different because of when it was released, when it, like, it was the first movie that came out using Premiere Access during the pandemic. So a lot of people, I think it was going to be viewed by fewer people than probably some of the other projects anyway, because of when it was, or the way it was released. But what do you think, where is the importance in including the musical into those live action adaptations? And really, are there certain projects that you just kind of say creatively, this has to have the music in it, and some others that you say maybe we don't have to have some of this music in it? And ironically, Mulan has I think one of the best standalone songs from that movie, and it wasn't in the live action. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's a great question, and I think sometimes it comes down to, I think Mulan, because of its original source material, they were trying to do something different with it, more authentic with it. So I think that was a conscious choice not to do that, simply because of the origin story. But I think you're right to a certain extent. There are certain ones that you feel like if they tried to do it without music, Beauty and the Beast, Little Mermaid, things like that, it wouldn't play as much, or it would be completely different, really, because Beauty and the Beast is it's you just think of the music when you think of that. I don't know that you could do that without, I mean, you could, but I don't know how many people would be interested in seeing it if it didn't have the music.
Okay.
So I think it's a lot of it is what is the intent of what you're doing with the live action movie. And the Mulan one was completely different intent than any of the other ones, and I think that's why that kind of stands alone. Though I do agree with you on the music from Mulan from the animated film Mulan is fantastic. But I thought they did a good job with the live action. I liked that they did something a little bit different with it.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with Mulan. I think from a tonal standpoint, it would not have worked if they had those characters in the live action version break out into song, just because of it having much more serious undertones. You referenced the authenticity. What did not work for me with the 2019 adaptation of The Lion King was that it played it way too safe on all fronts. And I'm happy to be where the cheese stands alone, but I feel like there was no inventiveness with the music. It felt very prescriptive and very much duplicative, whereas Aladdin, as you alluded to, it had that Bollywood flair. It had where okay, there was some interesting sequencing for like One Jump Ahead, for instance, and some of the other songs were interpreted in ways that perhaps I may not have felt that they were perfect, but at least there was experimentation. And I think ultimately that's generally what I'm looking for when I'm evaluating the music across different media, where there is some uniqueness, because otherwise, well, then maybe I'm just going to go back to the original, and I want the music to feel fresh. So there is some value to that. And just for a second to mention Toy Story again. So Toy Story, we can interpret, is it a musical or not? But that's an illustration of a film that had some songs in it, but then later Disney adapted into a stage musical on Disney Cruise Line on the Wonder for a number of years. It was wonderful. And I actually, prior episodes of my podcast, I interviewed the songwriters, Valerie Vigoda and Brendan Milburn, and that was an opportunity for them to channel the Randy Newman vibe, but yet still giving their own flair. And they're incredible performers and songwriters. But all that to say, what works for Disney is that is when they do try to take some risks, and when they don't just follow the same formula. So that's my interpretation.
Okay. We've had several different shows, popular shows that they, like on television and everything, that will try the musical episode. And just out of curiosity, why, what is the popularity of musicals that you think causes non-musical shows to kind of enter this space? I mean, we've even now had Marvel Studios enter with Rogers the Musical, which you've seen kind of flow throughout several different shows. And they had at the end of the Hawkeye series, they actually had like the full musical, or the full production of that song. And to be honest, I think that's something that if that were ever in the parks or on a Disney Cruise Line, I would love to see a full adaptation of that. What is the popularity that you think entices people to try and enter this space, whether it's for an episode or 2 episodes or things like that? Go ahead, Brett, you go first.
I would generally say ratings, but that would be a pessimist. I think it's that notion of inventiveness when you fall, like we were talking earlier about following formula. If you've engaged in something so consistently, you want to mix it up. So I mean, I can even think of just so many popular primetime series opting for that many seasons into their run just to spark some new interest. So and certainly if you have a cast who has a Broadway background or other musical talents, then why not leverage that? So I think it's that notion of what I was saying earlier about leaning into experimentation. It can be a risk, and it can flop marvelously, but by the same token, it adds a new flavor, and it perhaps is a way to bring in new audiences that perhaps would not have otherwise engaged with it.
Okay. All right. Greg, go ahead.
Yeah, I echo everything Brett said. I think ratings is a huge deal, and to back that up, I will submit the Once Upon a Time musical episode as a kind of last ditch effort to get any kind of ratings in that last season, which was so far, well, I won't get into that, but I think also to Brett's point again, when you've got the talent, if I'm watching an episode of something that has Kristen Chenoweth in it, I'm thinking, boy, I'd love to see her sing something, and or the cast. And I think that's I think that's part of it too. And it's I think just giving a show a variety or a different way of storytelling is definitely part of it. But I think and I don't know, Brett, that you're a pessimist, more of a realist when it comes to any decision on any show is going to come down to ratings. And if it's deploying that cast that you have that can sing, then go ahead and do it. If you think it'll bring people in for whatever reason, go ahead and do it. But I think you also mentioned earlier, Brett, that music is kind of that universal language. And I think that speaks to it too. I think that's why people enjoy those episodes when they come on, except
Well,
for the Once Upon a Time one.
one thing I think that's interesting in going to that ratings statement is that, you know, it seems like there's a sentiment that people don't enjoy musicals when they are kind of folded into another popular story, but those episodes are viewed, I mean, they're viewed a lot. So on some level they have to be viewed favorably as well. That it does seem like, you know, most shows that have run for a long enough period, especially kind of early 2000s to, you know, in the aughts, we'll say, they at least like kind of, they at least dip their toe into that space. And now, Barbara, can you hear everybody now? Okay. So I quickly want to introduce Professor Barbara Burgess-Lefebvre. She was able to join us. She's at Robert Morris University. And for quick, we're about to get into our top list. Barbara, if you could give us that quick kind of recap for the people that maybe haven't listened to the other episodes that you've been on.
Sure. I am a theater and English professor, do a lot of musicals, teach an honors class about Disney, and I also, one step aside, work for Disney as part of their Disney Musicals in Schools, which is a program to bring Disney junior musicals to at-risk middle schools. Currently directing Jungle Book.
And so the next thing that I want to talk about is, and let's start outside of Disney. It doesn't have to, we'll start outside of the Disney scope. We'll go around, and now, like, we'll kind of go right to left. So now I guess Barbara will go first, then Brett, then Greg. What are your top 2 or 3 musicals that are not specific to Disney? Top 2 or 3 musicals that you have enjoyed throughout your life?
I really like history. So I love 1776. A lot of the words right from the minutes of those meetings. And the other one is Stephen Sondheim's Assassins, which is about all of the people that unsuccessfully or successfully tried to kill a standing president.
You know, just coincidentally, those 2 are, I've seen both of those without any prior knowledge going into either of them. And they both were, one was a community production, and when I was living in Greeley, Colorado, I saw 1776 and really, really enjoyed it. Another, about probably a year before that, I was living in Austin, Texas, and went to a university production of Assassins. And like I said, had no prior knowledge of either one of those, and walked out humming along with it and downloading soundtracks and things like that. So
It occurs to me, I can barely see it. Up here's a piece of a t-shirt from when I directed it that says, "Other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play?"
Yeah. Brett, go ahead.
I think my musical expertise is very, very far low down compared to you, Barbara. So I don't know in terms of like the wide variety of options what I can choose from, and what your interpretation would be. For me, it would be Stephen Sondheim's Company, which I'm a huge fan of across different iterations, and most recently it had a run on Broadway last year, where the main character was there was a gender swap of Bobby, the title character, but it's a fantastic production, especially the 2011 stage concert version with Neil Patrick Harris and colleagues. So I love the music from that, and I feel like it's just a nice narrative of like young adulthood, and making sense of not necessarily being in a relationship and finding your place in the world. Avenue Q also is high on my list. Just talk about being inventive. It's just kind of totally tearing apart Sesame Street, making it adult, but ultimately super clever in terms of the mix of both the puppets and the actors, and both of them channeling emotions, and you don't know where your eyes should be going because you're just so enveloped in all of that. And certainly there's a connection to Disney because of Bobby Lopez Robert Lopez became such a huge sensation following that.
Okay. All right, Greg.
Yeah, and book. I mean, who would have ever thought that the guy who wrote the music for Book of Mormon and Avenue Q would be one of Disney's most famous composers for musicals. So I'll switch gears because I could go on about a number of stage musicals that I just love. Once on This Island, and Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown, which is kind of an obscure one that I thought was really good. But I'm going to go to the movie musical aspect, which is also stage musical. But I'm going to say My Fair Lady, Music Man, classics like that. I would love to see. I think they fit into kind of that Disney-ish mold of storytelling. And I think those are both Warner Brothers films at this point. So also from a musical that kind of has that Disney tie-in would be Little Shop of Horrors. I think is a classic one that has that Menken and Ashman tie-in as well.
Yeah, and we actually you bringing that up, we haven't mentioned the Howard documentary on Disney Plus, which is something that the students watch also. And I didn't know that he did Little Shop of Horrors before, and also the link between, and I forget her name now, but and she just passed away, the Little Mermaid, and who played the Little Mermaid in the animated feature? Jodie Benson.
Pat Carroll.
Okay, then I'm sorry, I'm thinking of someone else then, with Jodie Benson. But the kind of the link between her and how she kind of got involved with the animated feature and everything, coming from Howard Ashman. You three mentioning things gave me like 50 other ideas, and I'm thinking like, oh my goodness, this is one that I should mention. And I mean, I think as far as humor and everything, the Book of Mormon is up there. I mean, there are so many that are just so great. But I have two written down that when I was growing up, I loved Tommy, and we went to see Tommy a lot. And that was kind of my introduction to musicals. I thought that's what musicals were. So much so that one time we went to see the Phantom of the Opera, and when I was younger, my mom asked me what I thought, and I said, well, I would have liked it better if it were the Phantom of the Rock Opera, because I thought that's what all musicals were. I thought they're a rock opera like Tommy. And the other musical I saw over and over growing up was Cats. And so those two kind of stand out to me. I love those. I even love the 2019 movie version of Cats, and I know that's been horribly panned, but the soundtrack version of that, I love that. And then Brett, you mentioning Neil Patrick Harris made me remember a little project, Dr. Horrible sing-along blog, that was just, I mean, when you get into humor and everything, that stands up there as well. So I think, so now looking at, and Greg, some of the things you said were actually some of my responses to later questions about what I wish were on Disney Plus. And isn't there is a Music Man that is associated with Disney, right? Is that the one that Matthew Broderick did, right? Like in late 90s, early 2000s, maybe.
Yeah,
which isn't on Disney Plus.
Yeah, that was on ABC, right? They did that on ABC, I think.
Yeah. So now looking at what is on Disney Plus right now, because this will kind of lead into what people can consume on the streaming service and maybe give students and non-student listeners some path going forward if they're interested in knowing more or being exposed to more musicals. What are your top 2 or 3 musicals that are on Disney Plus right now? And they can be animated, they could be the Broadway pro shoots, they can be movie musicals, they could be Disney channels, whatever you would like. Go ahead, Barbara, you go ahead and start.
Okay. I'll go two very different directions. The most recent West Side Story, which is gorgeous, and to go animated, I am a huge fan of the music in general of Frozen 2 and Coco.
Okay. Go ahead, Brett.
I'm gonna go with the generic standards, but I love them nonetheless. Mary Poppins and Beauty and the Beast. I feel like they're the peak for each live action and Disney animation in terms of musicals.
All right, Greg.
And I'm gonna say thanks to the Fox acquisition, I'm gonna say The Sound of Music. I'm gonna put Newsies up there, which is one of my favorite all-time musicals, and I loved the movie when it came out when I was younger, and I kind of was one of those cult favorite, loved Newsies where everybody else hated it. Yeah, even though Christian Bale wasn't exactly Christian Bale in that, as you know, because he was so young. But so Newsies, and I love that. We'll get into, I guess, later about the music, like movie musicals versus filmed stage musicals. And also I think and I hope it's still on there, I loved Lemonade Mouth. Is one of my favorite Disney Channel musical movies. So that's what I'll throw out there as mine. There's so many of those good ones.
And I think you know, of mine, one is Disney, 2 of them are acquisitions, although one is, I guess, is Disney, doesn't really come from Fox. But I really enjoyed Into the Woods, the movie adaptation of the production, the stage production. Hamilton, because I feel like that is the music from that is so is very different from a lot of other things. And actually it reminds me of, I mentioned my introduction to musicals being Tommy, and thinking that's what musicals were, is that's the type of music that were in all stage musicals. And it was something that, you know, once that came along, changed a lot of things. I think Hamilton has done that to a large extent as well. And I guess more so, we should say Lin-Manuel Miranda, and his influence on so many different projects. And then one that was from the Fox acquisition, The Greatest Showman, is one of my favorite movie musicals. It is not historically accurate at all, but during the early days of the pandemic, when that movie first released on Disney Plus, my youngest son would watch that over and over again. And actually, when schools were shut down and everybody was in lockdown, it was difficult to. We got him a like a circus performer suit, and so it was hard to get him out of that. He wanted to wear that all the time because of that show. So now, you know, talking about that does make me think, and I didn't ask about this beforehand for everybody listening. What do you think has been the best adaptation, or some of the best adaptations, you could do multiple ones, from Broadway or stage production to movie musicals? And they could be either Disney or non-Disney. And I'll go ahead and say, I imagine people aren't going to say the 2019 version of Cats, and that's fine. That's okay. But if Barbara, have you had enough time, the 15 seconds since I said it, to think about anything?
No, make somebody else go first.
All right. Greg, go ahead. You go.
First of all, I fell asleep during Cats on Broadway
Okay.
when we went to see it. In my defense, I was in high school and we were touring the city. We were up on a field trip back when I was living back east, and by the time we get into this nice dark theater with the comfortable seats,
Yeah.
it's like going to a planetarium after you've walked around the city. So anyway, so going back to your question, I think that My Fair Lady may be my favorite adaptation of a Broadway show into a movie.
Okay. All right. Brett?
I wish I could stall so I could have more time, but I'm going to, if it's all right, I'm going to modify this a little bit. I'm going to say that the filmed stage version of Newsies on Disney Plus is fantastic. Okay. So it's essentially the same thing. I mean, it wasn't filmed on Broadway, but rather after it's run. But I think that is an incredible experience. But ultimately, it does not answer your question. So I might need to think about that for more time.
Well, I think Brett, and because maybe we should talk about this and give Barbara another minute to think about what she was going to answer. But I prefer though. So if I had to make a decision between a recorded version of a Broadway musical and a film version of that, I would take the filmed Broadway musical, Newsies, Hamilton. She Loves Me. They did, which is another one of my favorite musicals that they did on Broadway Live or some other website or whatever. I would much prefer those to movie musicals any day of the week.
I agree, and it's almost like, for me, if I see the movie first, that's what I attach to the most. But if I've seen the play, the stage production first, then I prefer the movie. Usually, I'm not sure I said that correctly. Usually I prefer the stage over the movie. And so those pro shoots, that's why I was so excited about Hamilton, because it was a pro shoot. And even just thinking about, at some point I imagine there is going to be a movie musical of that, and that is how they do that. I don't know. But I agree with that. And I actually do have another question kind of coming from that. But Barbara, have you now had enough time?
Yeah. Although I think maybe sometimes the ones I think make the best movies are not necessarily musicals. I love the movie, I think it came out in the 70s, of Fiddler, was pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the producers is pretty good. And although I don't like this musical at all, I think the movie of Grease is head and shoulders above the play of Grease.
Okay.
But I don't like either. Well, no, I love the movie. I saw it in 8th grade, but now I think I'm too old.
The movie came first, right? Because there's some of those that the movie comes first and then gets adapted onto Broadway.
I can't remember. I know the movie hangs together. The story of the movie makes way more sense than the play, which seems very disjointed.
Okay.
I have to go. I go and evaluate high school musicals, and I've seen too many Greases. That may be part of my problem.
That actually leads into the other question I had, and everybody listening or watching now knows how difficult sometimes it is to do this, and maybe has more compassion for Greg the first time we did this, because I didn't prepare him for any of this the first time. Is there a movie musical that you have liked better than the stage production, or made the stage production better, made more sense to you than the stage production? And to give everybody a little bit more time, I'll go ahead and give mine first that I'm thinking of. I saw the movie Chicago before I saw the stage production, and I loved it. I loved the movie. I can say, if I had not seen that movie before seeing the stage production, or here's what I'll say. When I was watching the stage production, I remember thinking, if I hadn't seen the movie, I'm not sure I would know everything, be able to follow everything as closely with this stage production. So are there those projects where the movie version has kind of made more sense to you, has helped you enjoy things more than a stage production has? And I know Barbara mentioned Grease, but are there some other ones?
I will say, well, first of all, I in general, we were talking about the differences. If I'm listening to music from, well, even the Disney animated ones, I tend to, that ones that have been done on Broadway, if I'm listening on Spotify, I'm usually listening to the musical version, the Broadway version
Okay.
of it. I know that doesn't answer your question, but that's just kind of adjacent to your the last discussion. I might say Into the Woods.
Okay.
I never saw the original. I've never seen the Broadway a Broadway version of Into the Woods. I've seen a ton of regional theater versions of Into the Woods, and I prefer the Disney movie
Okay.
to that. I also prefer Meryl Streep's Witch to, when I know I get punched over the head about this, to Bernadette Peters version that I've heard and not seen. So I will say that. So I will say Into the Woods.
Okay. Another one I'll throw in to give Brett and Barb a little more time. I had never seen the stage production of Into the Woods. I've never seen the stage production of Mamma Mia, but I absolutely love the movie adaptation of Mamma Mia that came out 2007, 8-ish, somewhere around there. So I absolutely love that. So I think that may fall into that as well. But also I really enjoy that music. So maybe seeing the stage production, it would thoroughly enjoy that as well. I'm not sure. Brett or Barbara, whichever one are
I think
ready
in
to
a
go.
way I think in a way we're apples and oranges. The advantage of film is always going to have is it's going to let you see an actor up close, which unless you've got good seats in the theater, you're not going to see. But a theater production asks more of an audience. It asks you to pay attention. It gives you bigger images. It gives you, I mean, we would almost always rather hear a musician live than a recording of a musician, because we feel like we're in the room, we're participating in it, we're participating with the rest of the audience. It's just, they're so different.
Mm-hmm.
That it's a little hard, I think, to say. I mean, why I think the Grease movie is better is they changed the story. They made the story easier to follow. But a straight up, here's a movie of a show that was on Broadway. I mean, and there's some that tank, like Chorus Line, because you need the big picture.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess that's why I agree that I'd rather see an expertly, professionally filmed version of a live show than a movie, almost always.
Okay. All right. Brett,
Yeah.
go ahead.
I hold the same sentiments. I'd love to see more of that. Fathom Events was offering a lot of these right before the pandemic, in terms of those film versions, like Bandstand, which was a short-lived Broadway show, Falsettos, and others as well. For your question, I think the one that comes to mind is Rent. I mean, the film gets a lot of flack, but what I think you were kind of sharing with Barbara's with film, there's a richer and much bigger canvas that everybody gets to work with in terms of set pieces and different visuals. What I also appreciate with that is it's an example where they were able to carry a good number of cast members from the original production into the film. I think about 9 years had elapsed from 96 to 05. So they still could very much play those characters. And I think it allows for, at least for me, it allowed for me to even more appreciate, and I can't remember which was first, seeing that via film or on stage, but I saw a touring production through Broadway Across America with Anthony Rapp and Adam Pascal, who originated those roles and were in both the film, in the film as well. So I think seeing that thread line was really fulfilling for me as a viewer, and then ultimately really enjoying their work thereafter. So I think that's the power of seeing both the film version, the stage version, and especially if there's instances where it's the same folks, because you have more of a connection and allegiance to them as well.
Okay. All right. The next one is I know this is a difficult task, but top 3 to 5 Disney songs that you listen to. They don't have to be from musicals. They can be from animated. They could be from Pixar. They could be from the parks. What are kind of 3 to 5 songs that are your go-to, or you just, whenever they come on, you know you're going to thoroughly enjoy them? And if anybody has their list ready to go, chime in. If not, I can give you a little bit more time to think. So
I can go.
okay, go
Okay.
ahead, Greg.
Okay, so I'll first say Santa Fe from Newsies is one of mine. There's a interesting part in I'm trying to remember which way it goes, that you could actually see Santa Fe turn into somewhere that's green from Little Shop. I'm trying to remember if it's, you start out with somewhere that's green and then all of a sudden it turns into the part um in Santa Fe, but you can get that tie. I always thought that was kind of cool. One song that always elicits an emotional response from me wherever I hear it is "I See the Light" from Tangled. I just love that one. I love the way it's delivered. I love the way that that's kind of Zachary Levi's, first foray into, musicals before he went on to Broadway. Then, and A Whole New World, I guess I also get that kind of response to as well. And then if we look at villain songs, there's Friends on the Other Side and Be Prepared, I think. I heard Be Prepared, the Jeremy Irons version of that the other day, and that's just he is such a great voice for that song from Lion King. So those are the ones from musicals, and I know that, I guess that's 5, but I also wanted to throw in Married Life from Up. Is just one of those that whether you hear the version of it that they play on Main Street or from the film, is just rips your heart out every time you hear it.
Okay. All right. Barbara, you ready?
Yeah, he got 6, so I'm good. I don't have to narrow it down. So my favorite is Go the Distance.
Okay.
And it's got to be a lot of people's favorite because they use it in every damn fireworks show now. But my favorite arrangement of it, so I directed a production of Disney's Descendants, the live version, and the kids at the school in Disney's Descendants sing an a cappella 8-part version, slow ballad, 8 parts of Go the Distance that's gorgeous. So I think that's probably my favorite. I've got I See the Light. I've got I'll Make a Man Out of You, because Mulan is my favorite. And when my daughter was really little, she would sing Let's Get Down to Business and a beat done. So I always think of that. Villain songs, I like Mother Knows Best. That's my go-to if I'm asked to sing and I am occasionally at Disney reviews, because that's a really fun song to sing. I also love Newsies, but I would go Once and For All. But I like that within the context of the show because it builds and it's powerful. And from the parks, anything from the Wishes soundtrack. Okay. The whole darn thing I'll listen to.
Okay. All right, Brett, go ahead.
Yeah, those are all fantastic selections. I think my 4 have a common formula, and I talked about earlier about how much I love songs that engage in experimentation, but these 4 are pretty similar because they all share element in common. Part of Your World as I feel like the ultimate I Want song with Howard Ashman's lyrics, and it'll be interesting to see the new interpretation of it in May with Halle Bailey. I think there's been some really lovely versions of Part of Your World. Olivia Newton-John performed it quite well as well. Belle, so the opening, more or less the opening of Beauty and the Beast, I feel like is an epic, just very classic Broadway feel. There's so many interesting voices and use of wordplay. You ultimately have the reprise as well, which I see a bit more distinctly and also fantastically. A Whole New World, so that's Menken and Tim Rice there. and well, that won the Oscar. So and I think a Grammy and a Golden Globe. It was fantastic, of course, that year. And I feel like that's much like Go the Distance. They try to find a way to sneak in a whole new world every time. And it's just, I mean, the orchestration is beautiful, but I also just love how freeing it is, and it's just a perfect duet. And then Out There from Hunchback of Notre Dame, which is extremely epic. It's been underrated for years, but I feel like as a lot of those kids have grown up, and I feel like through social media, there's been some really wonderful new iterations of it on YouTube. And so I think that's what's beautiful about the age of social media, where we get to see so many distinct interpretations of songs that we grew up with or have come to appreciate in new ways. And that was Stephen Schwartz there in terms of lyrics.
I've
Can
mentioned
I add
this.
something to that?
Yeah, go ahead, Greg.
So if you have not heard the Broadway soundtrack version of Hunchback, and you enjoy the animated film version of Hunchback, you have to give that a listen. It is so it's a little darker because they went a little darker with the stage show, but it's just phenomenal.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. I've mentioned before, one reason I really, really like doing these visits and doing the podcasts and everything for the class and people who listen is when I go into these, I think about things I want to talk about or what some of my responses would be. And then I always get more ideas based on what somebody has said. So I guess I said that to preface. Now I tried to have like 3 or 4. I have 7 written down because and my excuse is Greg and Barbara both did 6. So I feel like as host I need to do
You're the
more.
host. You can do whatever you want.
They're in no particular order, but from the parks, I absolutely love One Little Spark. That's because Figment's my favorite Parks character, maybe my favorite Disney character overall. So that song always sticks out to me. But Great Big Beautiful Tomorrow also. And those two, I think, I just enjoy those attractions so much. Maybe not the current iteration of the Imagination as much as the previous ones, but that's why they have such a high place to me. And here's one that I added because we were on the topic of are things like Toy Story, musicals and everything, and it made me think of this. One song that I love is You've Got a Friend in Me. We listen to that all the time. And I mentioned Encanto, and like Dos Gatos is great. We don't talk about Bruno. I think we don't talk about Bruno. That was kind of the one that everybody latched onto. But the one that I enjoy the most is Surface Pressure. I think that is such a amazing song. I mean, everything in there was amazing. I love Guns and Ships from Hamilton because of just the arrangement of that, and the fact that I think that that's the song that actually broke and set the record for fastest rap on Broadway. So I really, really enjoyed that one. And then from Mary Poppins and Mary Poppins Returns, Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious I love, but also Cover Is Not the Book from Mary Poppins Returns. And a lot of those are the songs that like I sing in the car when I'm with the boys or by myself. And a lot of them are because of the arrangements that they have as well, that are kind of challenging and fun to try those arrangements. So the next one is top 2 to 3 musicals on Disney, or I'm sorry, top 2 to 3 musicals that Disney owns but are not on Disney Plus right now. What would those be for you? And then the next question is the what do you wish Disney could acquire and put on Disney Plus? But of properties that Disney owns now, what would you love to see on Disney Plus that isn't currently there? Brett, you go ahead and start this one.
Yeah, I can take a stab at this. I There's only one, because I've been trying to figure out, okay, what's on Disney Plus versus what's not. I think the one that comes to mind was actually referenced earlier, and that's The Music Man from 2003, which was on The Wonderful World of Disney. And I feel like it got a home release right after it debuted on DVD, but otherwise, like maybe it's been shown on TV, but very infrequently. And I think there might be a version on YouTube that folks can check out. But ultimately, I think it's really well done. You have Matthew Broderick, Kristen Chenoweth, who we talked about earlier, Molly Shannon, and others, and it's a nice taste of what musicals used to be of a certain classical age. To the question about wish that Disney would acquire so it could be on Disney Plus. So
we'll do that
Oh,
one next, so you could spend
okay,
some
okay,
you
fair
could
enough.
spend some more time on
Fair
that
enough.
one. Barbara or Greg? Barbara, you go ahead.
Yeah, Barbara, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm trying to think what isn't there. I don't think the 60s Dr. Dolittle is there. Was that a musical? I feel like it was. It was Rex Harrison, so it was a talkie musical, but I feel like they sang. And the other one I would have said I wanted, but I think is there now, is Bear in the Big Blue House, which isn't a movie, which is a series, but that's the series my kids grew up on, and they sang every episode, multiple songs every episode. And I don't know, I heard that it was coming, but I don't know if it's there.
It is
yet.
on there. It is on there, Barbara.
Coincidentally, have any of you ever heard of Imagination Movers? It was I had never heard of it until lockdown and early days of lockdown. My boys watched that a lot, and I occasionally will still mention, hey, you remember, because I guess that was 2.5, almost 3 years ago now. You remember when you used to watch that all the time? And I love those songs. I love like just that series. I love the songs that they would sing in that and everything. Greg, go ahead.
Yeah, Imagination Movers was at the tail end of when my son was kind of watching that stuff. I'm trying to remember what else. Anyway, to answer your question, I'm going to take the easy way out. I'm going to say any professionally videoed version of anything that any of the Disney Broadway music. I'd love to see the Broadway Lion King, in the comfort of my own home. I'd love to see any of those. Aladdin. I would have. I've seen a touring version of Aladdin. But yeah, anything that they've got on Broadway, I'd love to see. Because doing that makes it more accessible. Broadway tickets are super expensive, whether you go to Broadway or even if you see the touring companies come through. At least here in Seattle, the tickets are still a couple of $100.
Yeah.
So I would love to see them do more of that, like they did with Newsies.
Yeah, they've got to have an Aida somewhere. I would like to see that.
Yeah.
Is the other question? So we were talking about series that Bear in the Big Blue House. Does anybody know, is Austin and Ally on Disney Plus? I used to enjoy that. My son was, as he was becoming a teenager, Wizards of Waverly Place and those. And Austin and Ally had some really good music.
Let me see. I'm trying to search real quick and yeah, it should. Yeah, it's on there. Yeah, it shows up. Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Did it run 4 seasons? It has 4 seasons on here.
Sounds right.
So, I think the one that I would absolutely love to be on there, and I've spent some time talking to people about what's the future of Disney Plus, and like, is there going to be a when 2024 rolls around, are they what's going to happen with Hulu when they acquire Hulu? I think this is probably something that would be on a Hulu, or internationally it would be Star. I'm not sure, even with the more mature content, people would go for this on Disney Plus a lot. I would love to see Rocky Horror Picture Show in any way that I can. I would love that to be on Disney Plus, just where that's one of my That's one of my favorite musicals. It's one of my favorite it's one of my favorite soundtracks. So I would love that to be on there. And then the last one that I have, before I did say there are a few rapid questions for everybody, but the last one that I have that I had sent out was, what are your top one or two, and if you need to go a little more, that's fine, musicals that Disney does not own that you wish Disney would acquire so they could put that on the service? Go ahead.
I kind of
Greg.
already answered that, I think. Yeah. And it would be through, let's acquire Warner Brothers, and then we get My Fair Lady and The Music Man.
Okay. I think both versions of Music Man would be on my list. Put the Disney version on, put the Warner Brothers version on. Brett, go ahead.
So Disney owns the Muppets, but that doesn't mean they own everything from the Muppets. So there are a few Muppets productions that I think were through Sony or other studios. Muppets Take Manhattan. So that is not on Disney Plus because of those licensing agreements. I think that'd be really nice to see on there.
Okay. All right, Barbara.
Okay, this is a go with me because it's not really Disney-ish because it's not kid, but there's a wonderful movie musical version of Reefer Madness with Kristen Bell. There's your Disney connection. That I always struggle to find when I want to show clips of it in class. I would love to have that more accessible.
I had no idea there was a musical version of that.
Oh, it's hilarious. And it is Disney, in fact, in a subversive way, because it's about censorship. And that's some of the issues they're fighting now. So
yeah. I think, Greg, like I said, I think Music Man, as far as musicals they don't own, I would love that one to be on there. So I have 3 rapid fire questions. And as two of you know, Brett, you don't know this yet, but we do rapid fire questions or rapid questions at the end. And these are things that you can explain. You don't have to explain at all if you don't want to. And usually they deal with the parks and things like that. And later when you and Brett, you and I do a one-on-one, then I guess maybe I have to change them up so you won't be expecting much. But these have to do with music. The first one is, and we'll go Greg, Brett, and Barbara. Give Barbara the most time to think about it. What is 1 or 2 songs? Doesn't have to be musicals. It could be anything. 1 or 2 songs that you think you listen to the most.
I mentioned the Rocketeer soundtrack earlier, so I think it's I would say the Rocketeer theme. I think I forget the actual track name, but it's the one that opens the soundtrack. It's probably that I listen to the most, and I See the Light.
Okay. All right, Brett.
Too tough a question. One that comes to mind for me is Son of Man from Tarzan.
Okay. All right, Barbara.
okay, if we're talking Disney, I've been listening to the Frozen 2 soundtrack, just the whole thing. It's delightful. And if we're talking non-Disney, my go-to song is Dancing in the Moonlight.
Okay. All right. Excuse me, the next one is, what song or songs do you like to sing along with the most? I know some of those might be just your favorite one, but if you are in the car singing by yourself, or if you're asked to do karaoke or anything, what song or songs are you going with?
Well, nobody's going to want to hear me do karaoke, but along Barbara's lines with Frozen 2, Show Yourself. I love to sing along with that one, and I'll go back to Santa Fe.
Okay. All right, Brett, you're up.
Out There from Hunchback.
Okay.
And A Whole New World as both Aladdin and Jasmine. I can try to do both at once.
Okay. Barbara?
Let It Go.
Okay. All right. I love singing I love trying to do Guns and Ships, as I said, because of the arrangement. And I love Covers Not the Book because of we call it the fast part, and trying to do it as fast as we can. The last one is, and I feel like this is something people have thought about before. I don't know, maybe they haven't, maybe I'm singular in this notion, but if someone ever made a movie about you, what are there 2 or 3 songs that would be on that soundtrack about you, about your life? And if you do more than that, that's fine. I know sometimes people do, I've done in the past in class where people make a list of songs that would be on a soundtrack about their life, but I'm speaking longer to try to give you a little bit more time with this. But if somebody did a soundtrack about, or a movie about you, what would be on that soundtrack?
Well, oh boy. Thinking of existing.
It doesn't have to be Disney. It could be anything outside.
Oh man, this is a tough one. I would say, well, let's take a Disney one for me. A Dream is a Wish Your Heart Makes
Okay.
is something that has always been, since dreaming about working for Disney and being and has been steady thing in my life. Boy. I hate these lightning question rounds.
This is I'm gonna have a difficult time having people come back. People don't want to do these. We can come back if that's better. Brett, do you have 2 or 3?
Sure. I guess the one that comes to mind is Go the Distance from Hercules. I know that was referenced already. Some of the lyrics are a little bit self-indulgent, but if you take out some of that, I love the notion of that I don't care how far, somehow I'll be strong. I know every mile will be worth my while. I would go most anywhere to find where I belong. So I think that as an I Want song resonates with people because of the notion of life being a journey, and then there's often struggles. And I think about that often with in my case, getting a terminal degree, and what that represents for all of us who, try to attain our dreams, whatever they may be.
Okay. All right. Barbara, what do you have 2 or 3 that would be on that list?
Sure. Reflection from Mulan. Okay. That idea of trying to fit your presentation to who you are inside. And non-Disney, almost anything from the soundtrack, but let's go with Children and Art from Sunday in the Park with George, which, yeah, if Disney doesn't own that one, I'd like to have that movie available to watch. That was a good one.
Okay. All right, Greg, did you think of another one or 2?
Yeah, I think I'd go with Part of Your World, and I think that can be applied to so many things in wanting, in relationships, or being part of a company, part of a community, things like that. And I've always, I would say that's been a steady thing in my life as well, is trying to work out how to be part of certain communities or certain groups. So I'll go with that one.
Okay. All right. I think one of mine would be Good Riddance by Green Day, which actually also is the answer to one of the songs I listened to the most. That's spoiler alert for any students listening to this. We play that at the end of the semester because I think it's got a powerful message. Not the message is, I hope you have the time of your life. It's not good riddance to everybody. That's kind of the irony of that one. I love Blue Oyster Cult and Cheap Trick. I love Surrender. That would probably be on there because when I was trying to teach my boys about Marvel and the Avengers, I made up a song about the Avengers to that music to make it a little easier for them. And then I think one that I mentioned earlier, Great Big Beautiful Tomorrow, I think would probably be on there also. And so now I guess the something fun to do is if you have one, send me a longer list of what your soundtrack would be for a movie about your life. I want to thank everybody for being here. Greg, Brett, Barbara, I want to thank all of you. This was a whole lot of fun. I hope it wasn't too stressful in parts. Again, I say that I try to prepare people for these, but you always give me other ideas, and I am very good at going off on tangents. So I want to thank everybody. And Barbara, starting with you, what's the best way for people to get hold of you, to ask questions, or just to further any conversation?
Email is best. You see, it's the back half of my name that you see, LEFEBVRE @rmu.edu.
All right. Brett, what's the best way for people to contact you and also follow along with Notably Disney?
Yeah, you can find Notably Disney wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. That's the promotional spiel. As for me, feel free to follow me on Twitter. I don't always post a lot, but you are welcome to message me on there. It is BNACHMANREPORTS. B. Nachman Reports.
All right. And Greg, along with Heilman and Haver.
Sure. So, I mean, professionally, if anybody has any questions about working for Disney or anything like that, I'm always happy to answer any questions around that. You can look me up on LinkedIn for that. For Heilman and Haver, it's really just heilmanandhaver.com. We've got all of my stage reviews, and we're out there, all of our episodes and video features, and any news that has to do with that. Heilmanandhaver.com.
All right. And again, thank you, all of you. This was a whole lot of fun, and enjoy the rest of your day.